Today is the 4th of April, 2011. I'm in New Windsor doing interviews with Carroll Countyans for the Carroll County History Project. Would you like to introduce yourself, sir, and tell us where you were born and when?
Okay. I am Vernon Lanny Harchenhorn. I go by Lanny. I was born at the University of Maryland Hospital on Green Street in Baltimore. Only born in Baltimore. About 2 days later, I was back in New Windsor and have been here ever since.
Tell me something about your family, your parents and your siblings.
Okay, my mother was originally from Medford, where my grandfather was the manager of Medford Grocery Company, which was owned by Senator Dave Bale. He ran the Medford Grocery Company, which sold just about everything.
That was a big store.
Oh yeah, my grandfather said it was like a shopping mall before
malls.
its time. Yeah. Well, my grandfather then moved to New Windsor, and in 1936 bought Barnes and Snader General Store, which is on Lower Church Street. There's a pizza place there today.
Okay.
And what was his name?
My grandfather was John Calvin Strine, and he went by J.C. Strine, and the store was J.C. Strine and Sons, and that included my Uncle Calvin, who was Calvin Jr., John Calvin Strine Jr., and Raymond Cashman Strine, who was later postmaster in New Windsor.
Mm-hmm.
My grandfather was postmaster for Medford.
Okay.
And
so
that
there was a town of Medford at one time?
basically an unincorporated town.
Okay.
Well, the store's gone. That was bought and raised years ago. I'm sure my grandfather was postmaster because Dave Bale couldn't hold two offices of profit, and he was already a state senator. So he had my grandfather, his truly right-hand man, and whenever you see pictures of Medford Grocery Company, my grandfather's seated at Dave Bale's right hand.
So he was the right-hand man.
So you had my grandfather appointed postmaster, but my grandfather had to sign the check over to Dave Bale.
Okay.
Which it still irritates my Aunt Elizabeth, but anyway.
This was your maternal grandfather, is that right?
My maternal grandfather.
Right.
Okay, my dad's father died of influenza.
And what was his name?
My dad's father's name was Martin Harchenhorn. My dad's name was Vernon Harry Harchenhorn. My dad's only sibling would have been his sister, Ethel Harchenhorn Floor. They were from the area out around Bachman's Valley.
Was he a farmer?
No, he worked on them. I know my grandfather Harchenhorn worked on a farm. His father, also a Martin Harchenhorn, but with a different middle name,
Mm-hmm.
was the mining engineer for the Ebbvale mine, which is toward an area between Westminster and Melrose.
What were they mining?
I don't know, tell you the truth. As far as I think it was probably coal, but I'm not sure. That's a good question because a gentleman from 3M came to see me, and he had taken a picture of my great-grandfather's tombstone at Jerusalem Lutheran Church. And Darcy would know that's where Bill and Mary Crow went to church. And 3M, you know, we all think of Scotch tape, but
Right,
it was
yes.
Minnesota mining and manufacturing. So he was doing a book on mining in Carroll County, and he knew that my great-grandfather was the engineer for the Ebbvale mine. But I don't know whether it was limestone, coal, or just what. Or I know there was some, there were copper mines in this area.
Okay.
I know there were copper mines down around the Reese area,
Okay.
between Westminster and Reisterstown.
Yeah, I know Reese, because I live at
And there was
Vicksburg.
there was an iron ore mine near where the A-frame place is, on the road back to Medford.
Okay.
Though, in fact, I understand the man's still in there from a collapse of some sort.
And that was an iron ore mine.
That was
So
iron
that was
ore.
an open pit then, that was down in the earth.
They had some sort of a mining train. I guess it was like one of those little things on tracks. but-
Right, yeah.
Now,
Well, they
another
still do a
thing-
lot of limestone excavation here, don't they? There are a lot of quarries for
Yeah,
limestone.
a lot of quarries. We're
But they don't
surrounded
actually
with
call that
quarries.
mining, do they?
It's a type of mining.
It is, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, because there's a limestone quarry at Medford. Well, and there's one out
Yes.
here in New Windsor too, yeah.
Well, a big house back behind a lot of trees, kind of in a small estate type house. That was owned by Senator Dave Bale. And I grew up as a kid hearing about Dave Bale's Road. And what happened was Dave Bale was a Republican state senator. Judge Wendt, whose father was one of the prominent Democrats at that time, told me everybody thought Dave Bale had this road paved and he lost the next election. The truth of the matter is the Democrats controlled the county commissioner's office, and still is a county road.
Right.
And Judge Wendt told me that his father was in on that. The Democrats paved the road in front of Dave Bale's house. Everybody thought Dave Bale had it done for himself, and he lost the next election. So I doubt if most people know the true story of that road.
So
But
you
going
were
back-
born here, you grew up here. Where did you go to school?
Okay, I went to school at New Windsor School, starting at the age of 6, and I went to New Windsor School through the 10th grade, and then we were bused to the consolidated school, Francis Scott Key.
What year was
So-
Francis Scott Key built? Do you have any idea?
Francis Scott Key opened in September of 1959.
Okay, what year were you born?
I was born in February 15th, 1943.
1943, okay, so I'm 59. So you were bused for your junior and senior year, you were bused to Francis Scott Key.
Right.
And it was a new
Yeah.
school then?
It was a new school.
Oh, okay, right.
I was in the second graduating class.
Okay. And when you were a little boy and you went to the school here in New Windsor,
Yes.
do you remember any of your teachers there?
Oh, everyone, pretty much.
Right? Did you start in kindergarten or first grade?
First grade, we didn't have
No
kindergarten then.
kindergarten.
But I should mention too, I was very close to my grandfather because
Which grandfather?
the only one who was living, John Strine,
Oh, of course, the other one.
Because-
passed on.
my father had been drafted in 1940, and he was supposed to get out of the Army a couple days after Pearl Harbor was bombed, and
Well,
he was in the Army till February of 1946.
oh, right through
Combat
the end of the war
engineer.
beyond.
So the only kind of like father figure I had till I
Right.
was 3 was my grandfather.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of teachers, my first grade teacher, Regina Rook, would tell you that they were ready for me because she says they knew how spoiled I was. And I had my mother and my grandfather, my grandmother, and my Aunt Elizabeth to wait on me.
Catering to your every need.
But then this sister that I wanted so bad came along. We moved into our own home because nobody would rent a house with a 3-year-old, 4-year-old kid
Right.
in 1946. And so I lost 3 of my wait staff, and my mother was busy with this kid, so it was terrible. I did. She caught me running away from home on my tricycle. I got to the corner of what's now Union Bridge Road and Maple Avenue, and my mother finally caught me. So anyway, Regina Rook was my first teacher,
Uh-huh.
and her name was Griffin when we started, and during Christmas break, she married Castle Rook. So my second grade teacher was Mary Hoffman, and at Christmas break, she married Charles Rook. So I had 2 Mrs. Rooks the second half of the first and second grade. Third grade, I had a lady who never married, Miss Carey. And then fourth grade, Esther Wilt. And Esther Wilt was very good at, they'd probably want to put her in prison today, but I deserved it. She would shake us boys if we wouldn't stop talking.
Uh-huh.
And when my son John was a little kid, I used to tell him how Mrs. Wilt shook Daddy. And I would go, shake my son back and forth and say, Lanny Harchenhorn, you better stop talking or I'm going to... So we went to the hospital 3 years later when John was about 3, when my son Billy, Hans William Harchenhorn, was born.
Mm-hmm.
And the lady who was working as a volunteer at the front desk of the hospital was Mrs. Wilt.
Oh.
And when I said, "Hi, Mrs. Wilt," John just froze. I don't know whether he thought she was going to come out and shake him, but he did. He just froze.
Or shake Daddy.
Maybe so. Yeah, that could have been. So then in the fifth grade, I had one of the best teachers I ever had anywhere, law school, college, anything. And that was Rebecca Harmon, Becky Harmon, who was a later town council member here in New Windsor. Becky Harmon was my fifth grade teacher. Then she moved up to junior high school, and I had her in the 8th grade, I believe it was. So, all right, then my 6th grade teacher was Miss Ivy Fowler. And she was also the principal of the elementary school. And she had a part-time assistant by the name of Mrs. Taylor, who was at Elmer Wolf 2.5. Elmer Wolf was a school in Union Bridge.
Mm-hmm.
She was with the 6th grade in Elmer Wolf for 2.5 days a week, and with us 2.5 days a week. Miss Ivy, by the way, with my cousin John Strine, who's John Calvin III. We were the third generation of the Strine family that she had taught.
Mm-hmm.
She taught my grandfather's youngest brother, George Strine, my mother, and us.
And then you.
Yes.
Right.
So us boys, like Robin Cairns, Julia Cairns' son, Brian Benedict, Mike Schlee, Richard Enzer. When Mrs. Taylor wasn't there, a lot of the time Miss Ivy would be working on her bureaucratic paperwork as principal of the elementary school. So we would read Mad Magazine, the Alfred E. Newman
Right,
thing. That was the big thing in the 6th grade, and we would hide it behind a notebook and read about Alfred E. Newman. And about that time, Mad came out with one of their magazines. 1 month, the front and the back looked just like a composition book.
Okay.
And they said you punks
Didn't even
won't
have to
have
hide
to
it
put it
then.
in your notebook this week, or this month. And the other thing I've got to tell you, there was a gentleman, Raymond Brown, who with his wife Irma ran a confectionery, soda fountain, little restaurant on the corner.
Was that
of
Brownies?
Brownies.
I keep hearing so
Brownies
much about
Corner.
Brownies. Mm-hmm.
And he sold magazines. And Brownie was hard of hearing, and he also sold hearing aids. Brownie knew me from the day my mother carried me in there the first time. And this was one of the great things about New Windsor. As a kid, though we did not appreciate it at the time, you couldn't do anything that your parents didn't know about it, usually before you got home. And I went into Brownie's to buy Mad Magazine. And he thought I wanted Man, M-A-N, which I'd only ever sneaked a peek at it, and it had like some guy carrying a woman over his shoulder or something. And I didn't know it was supposed to be the dirtiest magazine you could buy. And anyway, he thought I said man.
Mm-hmm.
And to abbreviate it, I was pleading. He was picking the phone up, the receiver on the phone, to call my mother.
Telling you you're looking for pornography.
When, like a knight in shining armor, his wife came out of the kitchen door and said, "Brownie, he wants that silly magazine all these boys buy." And he said, "Why, that's not, his mother wouldn't want it." She said, no. And she said, "Just wait." And she pulled one off of the shelf and showed him what it was. So I almost had a heart attack at the age of like 12. So anyway, then in the 7th grade, the teacher wasn't from New Windsor, a Miss Feeman. 8th grade, we had Mrs. Eberly, E-B-E-R-L-E, I believe. Her husband, John, was the head person, the director or whatever, of the Church of the Brethren's Washington office.
Oh, okay.
He was also a very good minister, and he was, he was somewhat retired, he was a minister at Edgewood Church of the Brethren.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, Mrs. Eberly was our 8th grade teacher. Then in the 9th grade, the teacher all us boys had a crush on, Lois Abigail Kaufman. She was just out of college. And I had the added benefit of, she was a customer at my dad's garage.
Okay.
So I had like a special in with her. She was engaged to the son of the owner of Kuntz Creamery.
Okay.
And I guess they're still married. So then they were homeroom teachers pretty much
How old were you before you got a male teacher?
That's a good, that would have been in the 10th grade. No, it would have been the 9th grade. 8th grade. 9th grade. Okay, it was Mr. Jones.
Did you have men for PE class?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
We first had phys ed, I guess, in the 7th grade.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
I'm sure your class teachers probably did phys ed with you in elementary school.
Well, that was true. What phys ed we had, we did. I don't know, we called it anything special, but yeah, I remember because in the 5th grade, Mrs. Harmon always had her 5th grade class put on a show or gymnastics for the rest of the school. And there was a gentleman who was a minister at the St. Paul's Methodist Church, Reverend Robson, whose son David was one of my best friends. David was the preacher's son that all the stories are told about. And he was a good kid, but he knew more honorary things. So my mother said that David and I were out there on the floor standing on our heads. And Reverend Robson turned to my mom and said, I always knew David's head was good for something. So.
Would you say you were a bit of a tearaway as a young boy?
Oh, I wouldn't say so. My grandfather said I was all boy. Some of the teachers would have said I never hurt anybody. I didn't like fighting and stuff like that. And I liked to talk.
Right.
Oh, that's another story. God, you'll be here forever.
Well, we haven't even got you out of high school yet, but go on.
No. Well, I'm sure I was seated near the teacher's desk because of my talking. I also didn't mind spitballs and things like that. Paper airplanes I loved. And I had my left hand on top of the desk talking to the kid to my right. And all of a sudden I felt a sting on my left hand. And Mary Rupp had smacked it with the ruler. So we had seen the movie The Greatest Show on Earth. Every kid with decent parents was taken to see The Greatest Show on Earth. And in the movie, this trapeze artist, the great Sebastian, fell and crushed his left hand. And he held it all twisted like that.
I can hear where this is going.
So at the dinner table, I held my hand like that. And everyone ignored me so I thought I better get some attention to my left hand. So I asked for butter or something. And I reached across in front of myself with my right hand to take the butter. Still didn't hear anything. So I asked for something else, and I really made a production out of that. And my mother said, at that point, my mother bit, and she said, Lanny, what's wrong with your hand? And I remember the words like yesterday. I said, it's crippled. Mrs. Rupp beat it with a board. Well, it was a wooden roller. And just like that, my father said, what did you do? Nothing. He said, oh yeah, there's nothing wrong with your hand, so just cut that out. Now, what did you do that Mrs. Rupp had to apparently smack your hand? I said, well, the boy next to me was talking to me. And my dad said, oh, and I'm sure you didn't talk to him. I bet you tried to get him to stop talking so you could do your study and concentrate. He said, cut that out, and the next time I hear that Mrs. Rupp had to smack your hand, I'll take away your bicycle for a while or something like that. I tried to get my father to spank me and just get it over with, but he deprived me of privileges.
You'd be grounded now, probably.
Oh, he wired my scooter to the rafters in the basement for 2 weeks because I was riding out where I wasn't supposed to be riding. And I was filling in for the minister at church when I was in law school. And I told how I appreciated now that my father had wired that scooter to the ceiling. And Mom said my father was almost trying to keep from shedding a tear, which my dad was not, men didn't cry in those days. But anyway, well, we're up to the 7th grade, 8th grade. So I had Mr. Jones, Ollie Jones, taught us then science in the 9th grade, then chemistry and physics. I think there was a chemistry too somewhere in there. But
Now, that must have been high school.
That was high school.
That was high school.
Teacher who really, really made a difference was Mr. Hyatt, Bill Hyatt, who was also, I guess he still is, a volunteer at the Carroll County Public Library. Mm-hmm. He really, really cared. He lobbied or whatever he had to do to get the school system to allow him to let our 10th grade class read Shakespeare. Mm-hmm. And we were said to have, and I think it's true looking back, we had a very bright class, the class that would have graduated from New Windsor in 1961. Mm-hmm. And then we were combined with kids from Elmer Wolf and graduated from Key in 1961. Mm-hmm. But there was talk around the school about, what an exceptional, fairly, I don't want to say it, but bright mm-hmm. group of people our class was made up of.
Were you a good student?
I was until I remember partway through the 10th grade, Mike Shelley and I were getting perfect scores on history exams. Mm-hmm. And then I was supposed to work in the family garage. My parents couldn't afford college for one thing, and I know my mother pretty much wanted me to do what I wanted to do. My father later was very proud of my college and law school, but mm-hmm. it was planned pretty much from the time I was born, I think, that Dad, and it was quite an achievement for my dad to have his own garage mm-hmm. business. And that was located at 307 High Street, where New Windsor Automotive is today. And I went to work. We opened the day after Labor Day when I was in the 9th grade, 1957. And then I worked at the garage before and after school and all day Saturday. And I still had really good grades. And then...
Did you enjoy working at the garage?
Yes.
You think you enjoyed the work or you enjoyed being with your dad?
Oh, both.
Okay.
Well, I'm still an absolute car fanatic.
Okay.
But...
change your own oil?
I wanted to go... Yes, I do.
You do? Okay.
Mobil 1. I wanted to go to college. Mr. Hyatt, in the 10th grade, I got my driver's license. I had to wait 17 days after my 15th birthday. You had to have your learner's permit 15 days before they'd let you take the test. Uh-huh.
So you weren't 16 yet when you took the test?
I was,
Oh, you were,
but
okay.
it really annoyed me that I had to wait 2 extra days because the motor vehicle test was only given in Westminster on Fridays.
Okay.
And I wanted my father to drive me down to Glen Burnie so I could take the test on the 15th day, not the 17th, which he refused to do. He said I'd waited 16 years and 15 days, I could wait 2 more.
Right.
So then I really did let my grades go downhill.
Once you got a car.
Yeah, I
Right.
think that was probably more than a coincidence.
Mm-hmm. Kind of sounds like it.
And
Were
I
you ever
know,
reconciled to having a sister? You said she
Oh,
upset the
yes.
apple cart when she came into the house.
oh yes, I love my sister, I always did, but I didn't get the attention I felt I was used to.
Okay.
Yeah, so I have a younger brother, Terry.
Oh, another one came along.
Terry Lee Harchenhorn. He was born when I was 12, I guess.
So quite big gaps between you kids.
Well, my sister was born 3 years later, and then my brother 9 years after my
Right.
sister.
Uh-huh.
But, we all got along fine. We've all...
What did you play as children?
Well, Kenny, my best friend growing up was Kenny Robertson, whose father was Dr. Merity Robertson, the town doctor.
Mm-hmm.
And Kenny and I rode bicycles together, hit pop-ups back in the town park,
Mm-hmm.
played baseball, and our backyard was the bigger backyard, so we often played baseball there with other kids. As far as the boys and the girls playing together, my sister's best friend was Kenny's only sister, Sally.
Uh-huh.
Sally Robertson. And whenever I went to Kenny's house to play, my Mrs. Robertson suggested Sally go play with my sister
Mm-hmm.
down at my house. And then I found out years later, after I was grown up, that my mother and Mrs. Robertson found that it was true. If the 4 of us played together, it didn't last very long,
Right.
because Kenny and I tried to help them out by teaching them how to save a doll from drowning in the wading pool. So we'd throw a doll in the wading pool and they would have a fit and things like that. They still think we moved the pool one time when they were coming down the sliding board. So my sister and Sally both ended up in the wading pool. But we weren't that strong. I've never told us we moved the sliding board. They were so excited sliding down the sliding board that we picked up the end of it and moved it over the wading pool.
So they went down, they landed in the water.
Yeah, we couldn't have picked up that water. So anyway, they had...
How about winters when you couldn't ride your bikes
Oh
and
gosh,
play baseball?
we slid. We called it sliding.
Mm-hmm. Here in town, or?
Yes, the fields... Well, there was a field behind our house, and we could start at our front sidewalk and go down and out the back gate, and actually all the way down to a little creek in a field. That was when the snow was right for, like, especially if it had a thick crust on it.
Mm-hmm.
We would slide also down Maple Avenue. There was no post office there then, and only local traffic. In fact, Maple Avenue ended just beyond, next to the property, way after the property next to my parents' house.
Mm-hmm.
So we would slide down Maple Avenue. We could slide down hills in almost any alley in New Windsor.
Did you have a toboggan or a sled?
Sled
Sled,
with
no
runners.
toboggans.
No.
Never skied?
No, I didn't. I think Kenny might have after we got older, but not around here. The big place to slide was Church Street, which, you know, as you come in from Westminster, you barrel. But we were allowed to block off Church Street. We put up like orange crates and stuff at the
Unofficial barricades.
at the top of the hill, and then we put them across at High Street. But there was more than one of us went right across High Street. There wasn't that much traffic in New Windsor then. If you went across High Street, you could go all the way down to the railroad tracks. So then the tough guys slid.
You weren't one of them?
No.
No.
I don't know why. There was a lot of sliding took place at the lower end of Main Street, which we always called Back Street. But I don't think the people who lived there liked that very much. But when Main Street in New Windsor comes down and crosses High Street, the pavement changes to where it's no longer a state road. And that would almost always be blocked off. But that was a good bit of a distance from Kenny's home and my home. And it had nothing to do with money. I don't remember anything in New Windsor being like, you know, who had money and who didn't, because we didn't. But there were some pretty rough kids that on the, I guess you would say, north side of New Windsor.
Okay.
And I know I wasn't allowed. There were kids that were shooting BB guns at one another, and we weren't allowed to play with those kids. And they were more likely the kids that would be sliding down Back Street.
Okay.
So we just didn't
You go somewhere else and
play
slide.
that far from
Did you ever go
home.
ice skating?
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I'd almost forgotten. Where some houses now stand on Lampert Avenue, there were these one huge mud puddle. I mean, that thing must have been like, well, it was huge by our standards. Must have been about 12 feet long and about 6 feet wide. And we would skate on it. If you didn't have ice skates, you just skated on your
shoes.
shoes
Yeah.
or galoshes, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, but that was funny. Like, it was pretty cold that one winter, and I remember Kenny Robertson, a friend of ours, Billy Sahalowitz, and now something like that our sisters might be involved in, but just the day-to-day, especially in the summertime, I think our mothers found, and our mothers were always home. That's something.
Yes, that's different too.
Yeah. And I mean, if we were at my house, my mother watched. She wasn't intrusive, but
She knew what was
Kenny
going
and I
on.
never fought. And I think that's true for my sister and Sally Robertson. My sister's name is Linda Elaine. She married Doug Boston from up around Middleburg. But we had an organization, which we still have, called the Polecat Rangers.
What did the Polecat Rangers do?
Well, it was loosely based. It was somewhat based on the TV show Captain Video and the Video Rangers. Okay. Well, they traveled through space.
Okay.
So did we. And I had this fascination. I still do. I'd love to have a pet skunk. But they had the Video Rangers, so we had the Polecat Rangers. And when my cousin John died of cancer, I sent him I'd gotten 4, they're like stuffed skunks.
Mm-hmm.
And it's Lee Strine, who's in management at Westinghouse. Kenny Robertson, who's an MD out in Laramie, Wyoming. John was career Navy and then NSA. So, and then myself,
Mm-hmm.
I had to ruin things by going to becoming a lawyer. No, I'm kidding. So all 4 of us were the members of the Polecat Rangers, and
Little club. Was it exclusive? Nobody else was allowed to join?
that's right. I can't tell too much about it even now. And our country was Skunk Hollow, which encompassed basically the land area of the United States of America. But since the United States of America didn't know that we existed, they never sent out the army to run us off. And after John joined the Navy, he became an admiral, and he was in charge of our naval forces. Lee served in Vietnam, so he's like our
He's your army.
head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And Kenny's the head of the medical, and I'm the head of the legal, so we still have the world covered. So,
Did you have a clubhouse?
yeah, we did. Usually it was my bedroom
Okay.
on Maple Avenue. We also had a wooden house back in what was then a woods and is now the town park
Mm-hmm.
that my dad built for us. And it was out in the woods, and we had a bench in it, and we could. There were, back there, because that was for all of us. Kenny and my sister and his sister, 4 of us all played together.
Mm-hmm.
John Strine, as I say, was a first cousin. Lee Strine, a first cousin, and 2 of my best friends. And then some of the other neighborhood kids would play back there in the town park.
Mm-hmm.
But as I say, it was the woods, and this is the way things were in New Windsor. People knew my dad, my family, my grandfather. They knew that we wouldn't hurt anything, and so if Dad asked the person that owned that woods, would it be all right if I build this? It was about, I guess it was about 6 to 8 feet by 6 to 8 feet.
Okay.
But it was fun. It was great. Then later on, my father bought an old Glade Valley bread truck, walk-in bread truck,
Mm-hmm.
and he sold the chassis to a gentleman for a worm seed wagon.
Mm-hmm.
Now I understand there's some synthetic medicine that Carroll County, I remember Mrs. Harmon telling this, Carroll County and I think some place in China were the only 2 places where you could grow worm seed, and that was down in the Taylorsville area. So Mr. Gurney Stoller bought the
chassis.
the frame and the chassis, wheels and all that for a worm seed wagon. The bread van part, Dad mounted on all level and on blocks and things in our backyard. And that became Polecat Rangers headquarters.
Okay.
And where the bread racks had been, my mother sewed for us by hand a mattress for each side.
Mm-hmm.
So we could, if we wanted to, spend the night
I was going to ask you
in
if you
our
were
clubhouse.
camped
Yeah.
out.
So we did. We had, I mean, a
How
wonderful
about chores? You sound like you
childhood.
had a lot of fun. Did you have chores to
Oh,
do as
yes.
well? What kind of chores did you have to do?
Well, New Windsor did not have a sewer system until, I guess, into the 60s. And our house was built, we had bands of clay soil running through the backyard.
Mm-hmm.
And it turned out we had a real problem with septic system. And my mother did full load of wash at least 5 days a week, I think on Saturday also. And so I would carry, and Dad had permission from the people who owned the field behind us, I would carry wash water down the back sidewalk, which was a distance of about 75 feet anyway, and dump it. And I got paid 50 cents a week to empty about, I guess, around 20 gallons a day of wash water.
That's a pretty hard way to earn 50 cents a week.
Yeah, it wasn't too bad then.
Did you get an allowance, or was that kind of your allowance as well?
Well, I had to earn that.
Okay.
And it was like another good friend of mine has been a pretty much lifelong friend since we were children. Ralph Robertson Jr., he's in charge of the county's ag preservation program. We never ever wanted for anything that we needed. We might think we should, have a fancier swing set or something like that. My father nor my mother ever drank or smoked, never gambled, so any money that was earned was for the family. And my mother never worked outside the home after she was married. So we had really, I mean, I've told younger people when they see an old rerun of Leave It to Beaver, it was like that. Our mothers didn't wear designer dresses like Jean Cleaver.
No, they had house dresses, didn't they?
Yeah,
and aprons,
yeah.
And aprons with bibs.
Because my mother used to laugh about Mrs. Cleaver, and the forerunner of that program was Ozzie and Harriet. Harriet Nelson always washed dishes in really nice dresses like our mothers wore to church, So, yeah, but Ralph and I were talking, we never ever wanted for anything we really needed. And
wanted might be different, but needed is...
Right. And we certainly had very good moral upbringing. And I will say, without being holier than thou or heavy-handed, I'll never forget the only time I ever tried to cheat, and my mother's reaction, and I was kind of speechless because my mother was always so easygoing. But we had a croquet set, and our backyard was a great place to play croquet. And the kids I played with would sneak an extra shot. And I remember I was right near the end of the game, and I was playing with my mother and I guess my sister. And a lot of times all of us, kids that visited. And Kenny and Sally and I were practically interchangeable at one another's houses.
Mm-hmm.
So we would play croquet. Sounds like we were old distinguished gentlemen at the age of
Yes.
10 or 11. But I took an extra shot. And my mother wheeled around and picked up her croquet ball. And I looked at her like, what's wrong? And she said, I will not play with someone who cheats. She never said any more about it. I don't think you could make me cheat.
Did she walk out of the game?
Huh? She did.
She quit playing?
No, she did come back
okay.
then. I said, I'm sorry, what did I? She said, you took an extra shot. That's cheating. So I learned, I mean, it really made an impression.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that to younger people would be interesting when their parents probably use this word at the dinner table now, but there was a lady, Marie Thompson, whose grandson, Paul, would come down and stay for a couple weeks at a time during the summer. And we had the bread truck, but it hadn't been taken apart yet. But we were playing in the body of the bread truck when it was still all intact. And Paul Thompson was a little more sophisticated and worldly, I guess, living in Frederick. And he was telling all these filthy jokes. And it was my Kenny and my sister and Sally Robertson. And we were all laughing. Now looking back, I think I didn't know what he was saying. I didn't know what a lot of this stuff was. It had to do with sex. I didn't know what those words meant. Apparently, I'm sure if I didn't, little Sally and my sister Linda didn't, but none of us wanted the other ones to know that we didn't know what was these cool words. So Paul told this one joke. He told several jokes that had the all-time dirty word starting with F, 4 letters ending with K. And so everybody laughed. And at the dinner table that night, in like 1956, little chubby Lanny Harchenhorn asked someone to pass the
Effing
butter, pass the effing butter. My mother's jaw dropped. My father never missed a beat. He said, where did you hear that word? I don't know. He said, well, I'm sure you didn't hear it from Kenny Robertson or Sally or your sister. Where did you hear the word? I said, I don't know. He said, must have been Paul Thompson. I guess he learned that word in school up or somewhere up, in Frederick. Well, I never was one to rattle or, tattle on people. And so, he said, I don't ever want to hear you use that word again. And that was it. But I'll never forget how my mother's jaw dropped open when I, at the dinner table in 1955 or 6, along in there, asked them to pass the effing butter. I didn't know what that word meant. I knew it was something bad, but I didn't know it was that bad.
So you went to high school, you graduated. How did you happen to get to go to college? Because you said there was no money. Well,
in the 59 early, as I was saying, my grades started to go downhill after I got my driver's license, and it's like March 2nd of 1959. And actually, I guess they'd started to go down a little bit before that. I was working in the garage. That's what I was supposed to do. It was a little bit like a lower level Edsel Ford arguing with his father, Henry, to let him go to college.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't like we were terribly poor, but that was not considered to be something you did.
Right.
And when my grades were headed downhill, Mr. Hyatt asked me to stay after school one day and talk to him. And I did. And he was from North Carolina. He was from the same hometown as Thomas Wolfe, because he was telling us how half the town wasn't speaking to half the town after Look Homeward Angel came out, because there was a lot of local people in there without them being named, but people recognized who they were.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I remember he said, he said, Lanny, it's terrible what you're letting happen to your grades. You're college material. I'll never forget that term. And that's the first time anybody had ever told me that.
Mm-hmm.
Mrs. Robertson, I doubt if I would have ever gone to college also if it weren't for Mrs. Robertson, Kenny's mother. She and Doc encouraged me to go to college. And I remember, I said, well, I have the garage. And she said, well, but how are you going to support a family the way you'd want to working in the garage?
But your dad did it.
Yeah. But I think she also knew my dad was a bit like Henry Ford in that I don't know if it would have been a long time before I ever was in any position of I was a very good natural mechanic.
Mm-hmm.
And that was one thing that my father felt bad that I didn't want to stay in the garage business. Mm-hmm. And truthfully, it didn't work out that way, but I thought by now the government would have put most small garages out of business with regulations, and
mm-hmm.
I didn't envision the environmental laws that are having a really, really tough impact on garages. Things that we used regularly, like white lead's treated like hazardous substance today. Mm-hmm. Antifreeze, a little bit of everything.
Mm-hmm.
But Mr. Hyatt encouraged me to go to college, and I was saying, well, how could I afford to go to college? He said, well, there are scholarships. So I had a terrible 11th grade. In fact, as I mentioned, Mr. Jones taught the science classes the last 4 years of high school. And he told me at the end of my junior year, plus another thing, I think I really didn't want to go to Francis Scott Key. A lot of the kids were all enthused about this new school.
Mm-hmm.
But I was very happy at New Windsor. It was walking distance of my house. I knew everybody. My dad had a garage business in New Windsor. My grandfather had his general store
mm-hmm.
business in New Windsor. So I guess in a way that kind of made me stand out a little bit.
Right. Gave you a different kind of security than maybe some other kids had.
Yeah. So in the 11th grade, Mr. Jones told me that he only gave me a D because if I'd gotten the F, I wouldn't have passed to the 12th grade.
He would have had to have you back again.
Well, he said he knew I could do much better,
mm-hmm.
and he didn't want to see me lose a year out of my life, basically. But I did flunked French. It's funny because two of the other guys who flunked French, I guess I could mention it, was Rob and Cairns, who later graduated from college, and Tyson Gosnell, who had a distinguished career in the CIA.
Mm-hmm.
It was a matter of application. I crammed enough that I passed it at the end of the first semester. Second semester, I really didn't even try that much. And the funny thing was, years later, I got B's in French at Western Maryland College, which was a very good, tough private college that I went to on scholarships.
So when you graduated from high school, then you worked the summer with your dad?
Well, I graduated from something that really made a big difference. I guess I kind of hit bottom at the end of my junior year. And then at Francis Scott Key, because of flunking French, I was out of the academic curriculum and in the general.
Okay.
And our section of history, or they called it POD, Problems of Democracy, it was like a political science course, was my 10th grade history teacher, Charlotte Kephart. And she was one of the 5 most influential teachers in my life. And in fact, years later, the last thing I did before taking the oath of office as a delegate was to call her and thank her. Mm-hmm. And then I walked up Cornhill Street to the State House and took the oath of office. And she was in my campaign brochure for House of Delegates.
Okay.
Because it meant that much to me. But so I had Mrs. Kephart again, and I really, really tried to do well for her. Mm-hmm. And one thing I found, and I've told people this in life, after the 11th, in the 11th grade, I had teachers who didn't know me. Mm-hmm. And they didn't know I was, a B plus A student. Mm-hmm. And so...
They only knew what you'd done as a junior.
And I had, I always think in grading an exam, if they think, well, there's something vague, and they think, well, that, he didn't even know this. Mm-hmm. Where with someone who I'd done well for before, they might give me the benefit of the doubt.
Right.
So I worked my way back to an A with Mrs. Kephart. Mm-hmm. And I remember at the end of high school, I went to work in the garage full time. And I worked there a whole year. And
you didn't go straight to college?
No.
Okay.
We were next door to the home of Phil and his sister, Moxie Stater. And she was a French professor at Western Maryland College. And she used to hear me arguing with my father. I wouldn't call it arguing so much as I would say, I want to go to college. I wanted to go to college so bad. Mm-hmm. And Dad would say, well, you get to work on that engine. You don't have time to go to college now. I want to go to college. She told me years later, she remembers that I would argue with my father that I wanted to go to college. And so when I was working full-time at the garage I graduated in 61, so it would have been the 61-62 school year. In the spring of 62, Rob and Cairns, who was my first playmate, by the way, we used to play through the fence down on High Street. Robin told me, he and Reuben Morningstar, that they were students at Frederick Community College. And Robin said, and Spike, as we called Reuben Morningstar, that they were having open house, and they were asked to invite people who they thought might be future students to come up to open house.
And this was at Frederick Community College?
This was at Frederick Community
Okay.
College. So in the spring of 1962, and when I told Kenny would stop by the garage, because Kenny Robertson, who later became the physician, he worked at the garage in the summers and once in a while after school. And I guess none of his patients whom he's operated on would appreciate the fact that his favorite job was scraping grease off of engines and things. So, oh my God, I wouldn't let those hands anywhere near my internal organs. So I told Kenny that Spike and Robin had invited me to go to this open house. And he said, "You won't go." I said, "Well, I want to go. I want to go. You won't go to college." Well, he knew how hard-headed I could be if somebody told me I couldn't do something. So he said, he got in his pocket and he had like 35 cents. He said, "I bet you this 35 cents you won't go." I said, "Well, I bet I will." So I went. And I found that mortals could actually answer questions in college. It wasn't anything, and I actually liked it. And the next year I started at Frederick Community College. I'll tell you that Doris probably knows who Duffy Spiker was. He was chief cashier at New Windsor State Bank. And as I say, my dad didn't want me to go to college, but he ultimately was always behind me. Like, he didn't want me to have that crazy Triumph TR3 sports car, but he drove it home for me in his Army Parka, because when you took the top off a TR3, the top actually came off, and it was missing a top when we bought it. So anyway, he drove it home in the dead of winter because I was in law school at the time. Well, Dad told me that Mr. Spiker, and Dad apparently had talked to people about how I wanted to go to college. And Dad said that Mr. Spiker said he was in charge of a scholarship to Frederick Community College, and that I should, apply for the scholarship. And so that's how I got to go to Frederick Community College.
And how long did you go there?
2 years.
You did 2
and
years
then
there.
everything transferred to Western Maryland College.
So you went to Western Maryland as a junior then?
Yes.
Okay, so you only had 2 years at Western Maryland?
Yes.
Which is now McDaniel, of course.
And no, it's not the same thing, believe me.
Oh, okay. It's in the same
Believe
premises.
me, a lot of those people couldn't get into Western Maryland with a truck. But
At what point did you know that you wanted to be a lawyer?
well, this is something when after Mr. Spiker's funeral, I said to his wife, I came to suspect that scholarship was Mr. Spiker himself.
Oh.
And she said, "Young man, that's a very good deduction." And so he paid my way to college.
There wasn't really a scholarship at all.
No, he knew
What a good man.
He knew I wanted to go to college, and
When you wanted to go to college, did you have some idea why you wanted to go to college?
Oh, I wanted to be a lawyer.
Oh, even then you wanted to be a
Oh,
lawyer?
yeah.
Okay.
Well, my mother told me Abraham Lincoln stories, and I grew to really greatly admire Abraham Lincoln.
Okay.
He
And
was
you wanted
a
to be a lawyer
lawyer.
like Lincoln?
Then I also liked the legal programs on television was one thing, and Also, a lawyer made it possible for me to not lose my driver's license for an extensive period of time when
What had you done?
I was speeding.
What was the speed limit?
Well, it was 50,
And you were going,
probably 60 something at least.
okay. Are you saying you only got picked up once for speeding?
No. I'd gotten a ticket after I had my license 2 months. And they had a system then that's kind of like what's been reinstated, where young drivers were sort of on a probationary period.
Mm-hmm.
And I got one ticket and they took my license for 15 days. And when I got the second ticket, my father was afraid I was going to lose him for maybe 60 days or something. And my father was a very, very good driver. He was just great when he drove the fire truck. I loved to ride on it.
Oh, he was a fireman.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, all of us. And he could really keep that old International revved up, which you needed with it. But anyway, so he had a high school friend of his who did whatever legal work. The only time, it's like Mr. Charles Fisher said, unless someone dies or they're buying a house or they're making a will, most good people don't really need lawyers all that much. So Mr. Huffman represented me, and I kidded him about it later after I became a lawyer. And that, you would have thought my father was on trial. I would do the same thing today that Mr. Huffman did, because today would be a district court judge.
Mm-hmm.
But the trial magistrate was not going to have any great sympathy on a 17-year-old kid. But the trial magistrate, they were appointed by green bag appointments. And they actually did have like a velvet green bag that they'd carry these things from the Senate to the House. The people the governor appointed to basically political appointments.
Mm-hmm.
And the trial magistrate that I had in real life was a used car dealer. And my dad had a used car dealer license as part of our garage business. And so all Mr. Huffman emphasized what it would be like, it would really hurt my father because he needed me to drive cars in the garage and used car business.
Mm-hmm.
And the magistrate told me, and I tell you, I was 17 years old. I wore the most conservative clothes I had. I even had a light gray tie, a gray sport coat, gray pants. I got a fresh flat top haircut, and I was so contrite. And the magistrate told me that if he saw me back in that courtroom, he would throw the book at me. And I took him at his word. The next year, I was always good at handling a car, which is probably one reason I lived to see 18. But I won the Teenage Safe Driving Rodeo for this area, which was the Tawnytown Jaycees.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess this was an early indication of legal interpretation. I read the application to enter the contest, and it said you couldn't have been convicted of a moving violation within the last year. I had been charged, but I hadn't been convicted. So I was able to enter the Teenage Safe Driving Radio, and I won that when I was 17 in a Krause Ford. So anyway, I went on then I got good enough grades at Frederick Community College that in those days we had an appointed school board. And Mrs. Marsh, the widow of Dr. James Marsh, was a good friend of Mrs. Robertson, Etta Robertson, my best friend's mother. And she told me that Mrs. Marsh told her that the state senator had scholarships to award to Western Maryland College. And he had turned those over to the appointed school board to be given strictly on merit. And I found out only after he died. That was Senator Edward O. Wendt Jr., who was my first ever circuit court judge that I practiced before. And he was so non-political that I never even knew that in time to thank him. After I'd been at the legislature, I couldn't find any scholarships that ever came up that were given out by school boards. But Mr. Haight, who Haight's Funeral Home, Neil Powell, who I know Doris knows. Neil Powell was mayor of Tawnytown and manager of Tawnytown. Mr. Powell was on the school board, and I bought this handwriting kit where you wrote on paper you wrote on top of this board that had real dark lines under it. So your writing was
nice
straight
lines, yeah.
And I hand wrote, and then I was given a 1-year scholarship to Western Maryland because, see, I didn't need 4.
Right.
Plus,
you did need 2, though. You needed 2 years.
And they told me that if I did well, they felt sure I would get a scholarship for my senior year, which I did. So instead of flunking French at Western Maryland College, I got a B in it. And I made the first semester, I took 18 hours. I wanted to take 21 because it didn't cost any extra to learn more things. So I took 18 hours, and I got the first semester I got 4 B's and 2 C's. The second semester I got 4 B's and 2 A's. So I made the dean's list. And that was very important because I'd been told that when you went from a junior college to Western Maryland College, you'd lose a grade average. So I'm to this day incredibly grateful to Frederick Community College for giving me a second chance, and I didn't want to let them down. And Dr. Whitfield used to say, Mr. Harchenhorn's the exception that proves the rule. Most of those junior college students aren't worth having, or something like that.
So then you went on to law school.
And that
Where
was
did you go to
accepted at law school. University of Maryland School of Law.
Oh, okay. And how many years were you there?
3.
3 years.
Now, I would have graduated in June of, or late May '69. But I was recommended by Dr. David, the head of political science department at Western Maryland, to H. Vernon Eney to serve on the staff of the Maryland Constitutional Convention, which rewrote the state constitution from September '67 to January '68. And I was interviewed by the Chief of Staff, John Brooks, and then Mr. Eney himself, and was hired. The Maryland Law School gave me a semester's leave of absence. And I was absolutely stunned when Mr. Eney picked up the phone and said, Bill, I've got one of your students here. And he gave my name, and he said, is he a pretty good student? And the answer was yes, somehow. But anyway, he was talking to Dean William Cunningham, my law school dean. And I thought, oh my gosh, he calls the dean of the law school Bill? Well, Mr. Eney was the managing attorney at Venable Bacher and Howard, one of the very top law firms.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it was probably the top. So I worked I was administrative assistant to the committee on the judicial branch.
And that was for 6 months?
And then Mr. Eney himself for the last month.
Uh-huh.
It was for a total of about a little bit over 3 months.
But that was an education in itself.
Oh, it was wonderful.
Yeah.
It was incredible. And I wrote articles for the law school newspaper, and truthfully, I probably knew more from that position because I heard all the testimony every 5 days a week from all the top judges and all the top lawyers for the article on the judicial branch. And then we finished our committee work, and the last month, Mr. Eney brought me upstairs and had me work as his administrative assistant. And then I had the opportunity to be a law clerk at Venable, Bacher and Howard. And
Which you said was a top law firm.
yeah, and I received a clerkship from Judge Marvin Smith of the highest court in Maryland, the Court of Appeals. And I'd been appointed to be his law clerk, and in the meantime I was working for the Department of Legislative Reference, which had an extremely good reputation under Dr. Carl Everstein. And then the political bug was really getting to me. And with Judge Smith and Dr. Everstein's blessing, I ran for state's attorney for Carroll County. And I won. And in the meantime, I'd been invited to join a really good law firm. Pardon me, a really good law firm in Carroll County. So I actually thought, the wise thing for me to do would be to pull out of this race, and because I was surprised that I was asked to go to work for that law firm. And then I thought, you can't do that. You told people you're going to run. There were people who, were very favorable toward me, and I remember when I sent the mailing out, I thought, this is going to make the difference. If I win, this is going to be what does it. And I did. I sent the mailing and I won. That was the mailing was put together, and I was the youth class Sunday school teacher for about 12, 13 years at Edgewood Church of the Brethren. But I was more like the kids because I was single, and a lot of the people my own age were married and had children, and so I was more at home with the high school kids.
Right.
So I became the teacher, and we put the mailing together in the basement of the church. So it was I used to say it was the election that was won by teenage girls and some teenage boys, like Karen Lease and Debbie Morningstar and Lee Strine. Lee was always there for me.
So how old were you when you became the attorney for the state's attorney?
State's attorney is like the equivalent of district attorney.
Right, and how old were you when you won that?
27.
You were 27, and you had never actually practiced law up till that point.
Well, when I was running for state's attorney, there was a lady who was supporting my opponent. He was a 2-term incumbent, also a Republican, Brian McIntyre. And he was talking about running for the Senate. And then people started talking to me about running for state's attorney. And that was what gave me an entree into the race without upsetting the apple cart, because I pointed out in this letter that when I filed, our party had no candidate for state's attorney. Well, I was pretty sure Brian was going to run for state's attorney again, but I didn't know it for a fact. And I filed around 9 o'clock in the morning and then went on to work in Annapolis, and he filed around 4:30 that afternoon.
Okay.
So it was true. But yeah, I was elected by a margin of 144 votes.
And how long did you serve? How long was the term?
I was state's attorney for one term and then ran for the legislature.
How long was one term?
4 years.
4 years, okay. And then you ran for the legislature after that, and were you elected first time?
Yes.
And how long were you in the legislature?
Three terms.
Of? How long
4
was the
years
term?
each. 4 years each.
So you were 12 years in the legislature?
12 years in the House of Delegates.
Right. And
All
during
on the
that time,
Judiciary
I assume you met
Committee.
your wife at some point?
Yes. I met her in early 1978.
Where?
In the driveway, in Bill Crow's driveway.
Oh.
You might know Doris is saying it had to do with cars, something. Margaret was filling in for her little sister, who was the babysitter for my Aunt Elizabeth still goes to that dentist. It was a dentist, and it was a Greek last name. I only say that for identification, of course.
Okay.
They lived on the second floor above Sidney and Dorothy Lease. So they would have lived at 103 Blue Ridge Avenue.
Mm-hmm.
Bill and Mary Crow at 105, and I lived alone in that big house at 107.
Well, when had you moved into that house? You
I
were still a bachelor when you bought that house?
Yeah, I loved that house, and it had a turret,
Okay.
a tower as I
I
call
know
it.
that so many houses have those towers.
And I was
this
in
area.
politics, and I figured I'd chain up my political prisoners in the tower. So anyway, Margaret, it was not too long after the session was out in 1978, so it was probably in April.
Mm-hmm.
She was babysitting for her, filling in for her little sister, Cecilia, for the dentist and his wife's children. And she was talking with Bill Crow, had the kids with her, which I think that I really did want to get married and have children sometime. And I think that probably...
How old were you by this time?
Let me see.
You were born in
I would have been
1943.
30, that was 78, so I would have been 35.
Right. So you're getting on a bit if you were going to get married and have children.
Yeah, it was Mike Sprague, who was a delegate from Charles County, used to kid me about it. He said the kids probably say that's that weird old man that lives alone in that huge house. So
How long did you and Margaret court?
I proposed to her in the parlor where my law office is now at Christmas 1978, and we were married August 4th, 1979.
Okay, right. And then you had 3 children,
Yes,
and the middle one died.
yes.
Yeah.
Vernon John, who's like me, we're all gluttons for punishment. John uses his middle name. My son, who was born December 30th, 1981, Nicholas Andrew, only lived 8 hours.
Right.
He was born prematurely.
Mm-hmm.
And then Hans William was born February 22nd, 1983.
And where are the boys
He
now?
goes by his middle name.
Okay.
My aunt goes by her middle name.
Where are your sons now?
Okay, well, eventually my wife wanted to go her separate way, and she lives in Tawnytown, and John lives with her.
Okay. How old
Plus,
is
he
John
spends
now?
a good bit of time with his fiancee down in Baltimore County.
Okay, how old is he now?
John's 31.
Okay.
Billy is 28.
Is he married?
No, none of them are married.
So no grandchildren yet?
No.
No. And you're still
So
that weird man
I have
who
to
lives in the
live to be
corner house.
100 and something if I ever want to see grandchildren at the rate they're going.
What, at what point did you set up your law office in the house where you are now?
Well, I moved things there, I guess probably around, well, okay. Margaret moved out in October 1997, so I was again all by myself in that house, which is 3 stories. The assessment people don't know that. It's 2. No, I'm kidding. But see, that house was the administration building for Blue Ridge College, and that big sign's well preserved in the basement. And then it was later, well, before that, okay, after that, it was the headquarters for the Eastern Conference Church of the Brethren. That was the 4th time it was owned by a church or religious organization.
Right, you said that 4 times.
Yeah.
It's been.
So I had an office on my law office was on Main Street in Westminster, but I had always seen people at the house and had an office there. But I didn't advertise it especially when the kids were little.
Right.
So I guess it was probably 1998. It didn't make sense to have an office in Westminster when the only people who go to a law office because it happens to be where they pass by. You probably don't want as clients anyway, because all the Main Street people used to come in and ask me about something that happened 30 years ago, and I would say, well, I think it's a little late to do something about your husband being injured 30 years ago.
And there are so many lawyers in Westminster.
Oh,
aren't
God.
there?
Gosh,
Goodness, there are
yes.
a lot. Is that because it's a county seat?
Well, when I started, I was sworn in as a lawyer before the Court of Special Appeals of Maryland on June 22nd, 1970. And there were probably about no more than 20 of us in active practice in Westminster or in the
How many do you suppose there are
county.
now?
Well, I was president of the Bar Association, let's see, I guess 1986 or 7, and we went over 100, and it's
12, 13 years
well
ago.
over 100 now.
Right.
A lot of it was because of the growth of population. Also, some of it is, for example, I sublet when I was at 263 East Main Street. I sublet to 2 law firms from Baltimore, one Baltimore City, I guess both Baltimore City, who just wanted a Carroll County address. And they had a shingle up, as they say, a sign, and a phone number.
But there was nobody in the office?
Hardly ever.
Oh, okay.
The one firm had a young lady who just graduated, just passed the bar exam, and then she became a master, as they call it, with the court system, like hearing testimony for juvenile cases and divorce cases.
Okay.
So some of them, they don't actually have people there full time. But there's also just been a tremendous proliferation of lawyers.
Yeah, there are so many in Westminster.
Yeah.
What kind of law do you practice now?
General practice. I do, sadly, a lot of the people I did wills for are passing away, and I handle the estates. I've never been one to do much in the way of like accident cases and malpractice and that kind of thing. But I do, like a good general practitioner in medicine, have experts that I can work with.
Okay.
Such as Stephen Friedman and his father Michael down around below Reisterstown. They're extremely good and extremely ethical. And for medical malpractice, very few even experts want to deal with that because the medical profession puts up such a stone wall.
Closes ranks, yeah.
And lawyers have to put out so much money in those cases that they don't want the case unless it's even, if somebody's crippled for life by a clear medical mistake, then those kind of cases pay. But contrary to, the feeling that all these doctors are being ruined, it is true that when there is ruination, it does run up the malpractice fees terribly. And there's something too that ought to be said, that an ethical lawyer turns down more litigation than he or she takes. I mean, one of the canons of ethics is that a lawyer is not to stir up litigation. And I really don't like what's being allowed with lawyer advertising.
I was going to say, you see so many advertisings on TV with ambulance chasing lawyers.
The idea, the honorable idea behind it is that there'll be competition and lawyers won't charge as much. But I think it's more than that. It's because there are lawyers who will take a medical malpractice case and just file it, I think, without too much hope of winning. There are some. And then they have to prepare to defend it. I was a member of the House Judiciary Committee and a co-sponsor of the bill that created the system in Maryland to weed out medical malpractice cases. They can't go on until they've been examined for merit.
Right.
And frankly, it seemed at one time like the lawyers might need the same thing. But really, it's all these ads, I think, are just disgusting. And I brought that up at a meeting one time with the Chief Judge of the Court of Appeals, that one of my clients is a dentist, and he had me check as to whether or not a certain little ad he planned to distribute in the subdivision that his offices are near would be allowed as ethical. And so I checked with the dental profession, and you're not allowed, a dentist is not allowed to advertise that his dentures or his crowns or his fillings are better than anybody else's. You can say the finest crowns available, or you can say that you have excellent dentures, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But you can't say yours are better than somebody else's.
Right.
So we had, the chief judge of the Court of Appeals had a meeting of all the lawyers in Westminster out at the auditorium at the community college.
Mm-hmm.
And I mentioned that and said, can't the legal profession do something? And the Court of Appeals could do it practically overnight to curb these disgraceful ads.
Mm-hmm.
Where if you tape a movie at 3 o'clock in the morning, you're going to see stars flying where cars collide.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going to tell you to see the law offices of so-and-so.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And one of them that used to advertise the most, who I think's retired now, was a classmate and friend of mine from law school, Stephen L. Miles.
Mm-hmm.
The L, by the way, stands for Luskin. He's Jack Luskin's nephew. Stephen L. Miles. And one of the things that they would say in the ad was that Stephen L. Miles, a former assistant state's attorney. And I kidded Steve that I was going to put him to shame because I was going to run ads saying, don't settle for a former assistant state's attorney. They're a dime a dozen. I'm a former the state's attorney, Lanny Harchenhorn. And he got a kick out of that. But his weren't nearly as distasteful as some of these where, you know, they show automobile accidents in the background and,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and all that. It's just disgraceful. Now, the American Medical Association restricts entry into the medical profession. Many of us think too much, but this was in a book I read at Western Maryland College, Capitalism and Freedom by Milton Friedman. And he said that the American Medical Association is the world's greatest labor union because they control admission into the medical schools.
Profession. Mm-hmm. Oh, into schools.
Yeah.
Okay.
And he was mentioning then, you didn't see a great number of doctors who weren't the sons of doctors.
Mm-hmm.
That was before there were many women. And he said, well, I checked into it a little bit. Their justification, other than some would say greed
Mm-hmm.
or money, they feel that if there are too many doctors, there will be unnecessary medical procedures performed.
Mm-hmm.
So they only want enough doctors admitted into the practice that all doctors will have what they call a livable income, which some of us would say means at least 3 Mercedes.
Right.
But
Well, and now there are so many specialities in medicine
oh yeah,
that, you know, they must have a hard time controlling that.
well there's an old Ralph Stanley Brothers Bluegrass. Back in the 50s, there was an old Stanley Brothers joke where he said, do you know what a prescription is? He said, no, what is a prescription or something like that? And the other one said, well, that's a note from the doctor to the druggist that says, I got $3 out of him, see what you can get. So obviously with those prices, that joke is at least the 50s. But
Well, this has been fascinating.
Oh,
It's going on
gosh,
4
I'm sorry to
o'clock,
talk
and
so
I have
long.
to go to I have to go to work.
Okay.
But I could sit and listen to you all day.
well, I'm honored. Yes, I graduated from law school and then became state's attorney and went into private practice.
Right.
Been in private practice ever since. I don't plan to retire.
You don't plan to retire?
Nope.
Nope, ever.
I hope my
And die with your boots
mind
on.
holds out. Yep.